stories and showed how they were not an anomaly, but a problem in the entire system. Jody, David, would you like to come up and accept your award? And now, for this year's Outstanding Young Journalist Award. The award goes to Caitlin Thompson of NPR for her investigation into an obscure business model that often targets financially strapped households who are unable to access traditional loan assistance. Thompson's detailed reporting used court, property, and eviction records, in addition to cold calling homeowners, to create a database of properties in the 10 most populous counties of Texas to calculate how much equity the homeowners were truly receiving and how that differed drastically from the company's promises. Caitlin, you join us on stage, please. Now I'd like to turn it over to Jim Steele and invite the Gold Award winners back to the stage for a panel discussion. And we will be taking questions and answers for questions from the audience as well. So thank you.
Good evening, everybody. Is this on? Okay, all right. You never know about these things, but from my standpoint, it's always a pleasure to be out here, not only to celebrate some really outstanding journalism, but also to meet with a lot of the students here at ASU at the CRONKITE. I've been doing this now for, I added this up before I came over. I think it's 18 years or somewhere around there. So this award has certainly been part of my history in recent years, and I always love to come out here because I'm reminded of journalism for all the challenges that occur with it from time to time. There's a tremendous bubbling energy that I see in the student ranks and in the work of many of my colleagues up here today. So the only thing I want to say, and then I'm going to start asking them questions about how they did this work and what led them to that and what some of the challenges were. And after that, we want to hear from all of you. The only thing I want to say is that there's a theme that kind of runs through all the winners this year. And it's a theme of individuals being oppressed by various factors. In some cases, it's just the health systems they're in. It may be the prison systems they're part of. It may be the homeowners associations that have taken advantage of them. And that's what I found so interesting. All of these stories are separate. People are doing these totally individually, different parts of the country, and yet that theme is constant through all of them. And to any of you who are journalists out there, or budding journalists, that's the thing to always remember when you're doing your work. People are important. Find a way to make sure people are in your stories. It really, at all costs, because that's the lifeblood of our business, telling those human stories. And virtually every one of these amazing articles and series that have won this year really represent that in really glittering detail, tremendous detail. I want to start with you, Margie. Tell us about how you got onto this amazing story about convict labor supplying the food to our tables. Something, you fulfilled my dictum of journalism. Tell me something I didn't know. And believe me, I did not know this.
Wow, okay, that's pretty high praise there, Jim, really. I'm so honored to be here and to talk to all of you. I think with this story, during the pandemic, it started with a question. Why are all of these people who are incarcerated being tasked with working? They are being asked and made to, make hand sanitizer, face masks, all of these things, while the rest of the country, everyone else, was being told to stay home, protect yourselves, and protect the public. So we just asked ourselves a simple question. Why are there two systems? Why are there two standards? Why do the people who are incarcerated matter less than everyone else? And that took us down a really, really deep rabbit hole that ended up being this project.
I want to urge everybody to read all of these series, and the particular one that Margie's talking about. Some of these prisoners were laboring on the land on which their ancestors had been slaves. That was like one of the knock your socks off kind of lines in this entire series. So, and it's filled with many of those. So, what kinds of challenges did you find? You worked on this with Robin, a couple of years? Is that right?
Yeah.
Tell us about the mindset of working on something that long. Is it on your mind all the time? Are you wishing you could wind it up after a year or 1 month or 1 week? Tell us about how much fun that is to deal with.
Well, I think you kind of go through various phases. So in the beginning, you're euphoric and you're like, we've got it. This is so exciting. Oh my goodness. And you're bouncing off the walls, telling everyone who will listen to this idea, right? And then you start to dig in and it starts to get a little more humdrum. Mm-hmm. And you're like, okay, we're setting in, we're doing this. And then you get to the phase to where it's like, oh, okay, this is real. We're now going to have to produce something, and we've got all this material. What are we going to do with all of this? And then you get to the phase where it's like, is this even a story? Is anyone even going to read this? I don't know. Have we just wasted all this time and money? And like, I don't even know what I'm doing anymore. And then the story comes out, and suddenly you realize, okay, wait, people are reading this. We're getting emails. It's being tweeted. Okay, maybe people care about this.
All you young journalists, take that to heart, because the whole process of doing any kind of a long-range project requires a certain kind of timing, and you have to adjust to that timing. It's one of the hardest things, I think, for many journalists to deal with, because you think, I need to get this online, I need to get this out, I need to get this on the air, whatever it is. But to do things right takes time. And in the process of that, there are all kinds of moments where it feels like you're pushing string uphill or something like that. So, Jody, tell us about your project. Jody and David have an amazing story about the Social Security Administration clawing back overpayments to individuals who, in most cases, have no money and have a great deal of difficulty even trying to make those payments. How did you get onto this, and what was your whole process of delving into it?
So one of our local TV stations in Atlanta had actually done a kind of one-off story in 2020 where they featured two families who were dealing with clawbacks. And didn't really recognize the magnitude of the problem at the time, as is very common, I think, with local news, especially in the TV world. You know, you're kind of on to the next thing, especially during COVID when we were all living at this crazy pace of journalism. And so we started digging into it in 2022 when another story came up in the same newsroom with a disability advocate who pitched a story about some folks who were dealing with the same thing. And I was in the meeting where the producer pitched it, and while she was talking, I started researching, because I was like, that can't be right. And I think that some of the best investigative stories kind of start with that can't be right. And I came across this statistic that the Social Security Administration had $21 billion worth of uncollected overpayments. And it had been clawing back about $5 billion a year from people. And when they say clawing back money, you know, you're talking about stopping people's monthly check to get the money back. And by the way, they use the term overpayment. You know, we kind of grappled with how to write that. Basically, it was mistakes. So the agency sends too much money, sometimes for years, and then realizes the mistake years later and says, oh, by the way, back in 2019, we paid you too much for, 11 months, and now you owe us $27,000. Please pay it in 30 days. And for people who live on a Social Security check, that is not just impossible, it's overwhelming. And so we set out to find the people who were impacted by those dollar amounts. And that really took us down a rabbit hole of, what amounted to months and months of reporting. Yeah.
Did you have any trouble with people talking to you, or were they reluctant, or?
We did. As you can imagine, people who rely on a Social Security check to live, who are disabled or, low income, aren't exactly eager to go on television and talk about that plight, especially when they're getting a bill from the federal government made to feel like they had done something wrong.
Right.
And a lot of folks were embarrassed to go on TV and talk about that. So yeah, there was a lot of reluctance at first. And, I think that as the series progressed, it became easier and easier because the people we were approaching realized they weren't alone. And initially, when you get that letter and you're the sticker shock of the big dollar amount, you're like, oh no, what do I do? And folks weren't necessarily equipped to handle that situation. And so in talking with us, we were able to share with them, no, there are many, many more people just like you out there. And I think that comfort made them feel a little bit better. Not that other people were going through it too, but that they weren't the only one and that they hadn't done something to deserve that.
Tell us what, in the early phases of that, when people were reluctant, how did you talk to them and finally get, don't tell me about the ones who didn't talk to you.
There were a lot who didn't talk to us.
I know, but the ones that you finally persuaded, what did you do?
I think some of it was really just comforting them and explaining that, this isn't necessarily
You're not
your
alone.
fault.
Yeah.
And I, what I always, in one of the classes earlier today, we talked about this. I think anytime you're trying to talk to anyone dealing with anything on any investigative story, it's always about their situation and why it's helpful to them to talk to us, right? It's not, I need you for this story, or, you need to help me, or, this is a hole we need to fill in our copy or in our show. I think that you have to center the people and what's going on in their lives and how things could be improved by them speaking up and talking about what's going on.
That's a really good point, because I think all of us go through that in journalism. There's some people we need to talk to, and they don't want to talk, and they're pivotal to the story in many cases.
I think a lot of times, too, the approach I take with folks is, I'm hoping you can help me with this, right? People generally want to be helpful.
Help, yeah.
And I think when you presented, like, I am working on this story, it's we're aiming to expose this, or we've figured this part out, but we still need to figure out this other part over here. I'm hoping, and this works, not just for real people, but for experts as well, and officials sometimes on stories. Help me understand this. Let me make sure I have it right. And typically, especially when somebody's an expert in a field, they want you to get it right. They want to help you tell the story in an accurate, fair way.
That's, I think, very good advice. Just bring them into the action. I need your help so that I don't make a mistake and you look bad or whatever. So, Caitlin, tell us, first of all, tell the audience where you went to school.
I am a proud CRONKITE graduate. I got my master's here very recently from the Masters of Investigative Journalism. So I went through the Reynolds Center. I spent an awful lot of time in this building. And yeah, I'm just so deeply honored to both, be honoring you and Dawn, but also to be in my alma mater. So.
Well, we're very honored that you're here tonight, believe me. And I think, so tell us about your project, which had to do with basically the sale, lease back of residences. I wanted to say one thing about this. This theme that runs through all of these stories, everybody worked differently, but it has to do with people who are in need, one way or another. Whether it's, a situation, people who trying to come up with ways to pay back their Social Security, or prisoners who are being abused unfairly, or in your case, people who had financial problems and then engaged in a sale leaseback of their housing their houses in order to kind of get through a tough time in their life. And it didn't work out so well for many of those people. So tell us about how you got onto this story and what your first steps were and whatever obstacles you faced as you got going.
Yeah, so this story came from a tip from a housing attorney in Atlanta who had heard of somebody who had just been evicted from a house that he used to own. And that's a really weird thing that doesn't quite make sense. You don't get evicted from a house that you own, you get foreclosed upon, and that's how you would lose your house. But evicted was a weird thing. So she didn't understand exactly what was going on. So she called me and asked, said, look, you should try to figure out what's going on with this sale-leaseback. Sale-leaseback is a really common type of financial transaction in the commercial space, but it's not really been kind of commercialized on this scale in the residential real estate space. But basically it's, you sell your house to this company and then you lease it back and you get a portion of cash up front. And some of the people who got involved with this company had the right to buy their houses back. And the idea is if you can't qualify for a loan for, your credit is not good or your debt to income ratio is off, you need a way to get some money out of the equity in your house. And this was an option that was offering you a way to access 100% of the equity in your house. So when I first heard that somebody had been evicted after being part of this transaction, I first off wanted to know if this was happening to other people. So I went straight to the eviction courts in Fulton County, because at the time I was looking in Atlanta, and tried to see, are there other people who've been evicted by this company? Sure enough, there were, so I called them. I think one thing a lot of us did was calling a lot of people, a lot of cold calls, and found a couple other people who had been evicted and had been in this situation. Some of them were willing to talk. But then I also backgrounded the company, tried to figure out who is this company, who runs them, what's going on, have they faced any criticism about this before? And I found out that there were a bunch of lawsuits in Texas against this company, and those lawsuits gave me complaints that explained what happened to some of the people involved, but they also gave me a lot of documents. They gave me financial documents, they gave me contracts, even the spreadsheet that the company keeps to show if people have paid their rent. I got all of that, and through the court documents, and that helped me paint this picture that showed, well, first off, people who think they're going to buy their houses back, that very often does not happen, and that some of the people who think that this is going to help them out of a really tricky financial spot are actually losing a substantial amount of equity in their house. And, some people had really great experiences with this company. Some people, it really did help them out of a tough spot. But some people, like some of the people that we featured in the story, one of the people lost, actually they both lost a pretty substantial amount of money. So.
What did you find most demanding as you went through this? Just the time you were spending, or the refusal of people to talk in certain ways, or analyzing the finances of some of these deals, or all of the above?
Yeah, I think there were two things that took up a lot of time and effort. The first was understanding these financial transactions. These are all 70-page contracts, and they're referencing terms that are not defined in one document, but are kind of defined in another document, and it's all a little, really piecing together what they meant it just took a lot of effort, and I tried really hard to make sure that I was getting it right, because it's really nuanced. That was a lot of effort, but then also building a database. We built a database of all of the people who had sold their houses to this company in the top 10 most populous counties in Texas. And the reason that we focused there was because I knew this was happening in Texas because of the lawsuits, but also property records are held at a county level, and every county holds their records slightly differently, and court records to see if they had been evicted also at a local level. So doing this nationally would have taken quite a substantial amount of time. So we focused there, and we built this this database that shows the people who sold their houses to the company, and then the people who bought their houses back, and the people who were evicted, and kind of tried to map out this whole, to answer the two fundamental questions, which were, how often do people buy their houses back, and how often are they evicted? Those were the two questions for the database. So those were both challenging.
More challenging, yes. You know, we also have two other winners who are with us here in the audience tonight, and I'm thinking of Nicole and Dakin, and also Ames Alexander. And Nicole and Dakin, could you tell us a little bit about your project? Just briefly, we have a microphone on the way. It's, correct me if I'm wrong, but basically you zeroed in on a company that was providing health care for prisoners, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, that's right.
Not very effectively, as I recall.
That's right. Most of the health care in this country provided to incarcerated people is done by private companies. So they contract with state departments of corrections and county sheriff's departments. And this one company was not very good at providing health care to incarcerated people. So bad, in fact, that it had been sued almost 500 times. It was sold to new owners who were looking for ways to get out of those lawsuits so that they wouldn't have to pay them. And so they moved the company to Texas, where under Texas state law, you can divide a company and determine how you apportion the assets and liabilities. So they basically divided the company into two. They put all the government contracts, the assets, into one company. They put all the lawsuits
The liabilities in the other.
liabilities into the other company, and then they put that company into bankruptcy and started negotiating with incarcerated people and other creditors to pay them pennies on the dollar.
And they probably figured, well, that's going to be fine. Nobody's going to see this because who cares about the health care of prisoners, right? But I think
Yeah.
that's the most amazing thing about your story, the way you unravel this, and it just shows you what sometimes goes on below the surface that never surfaces to the average reader, or person, or viewer. And so congratulations to you and
Yeah.
Nicole for really bringing that to light. It's just
Thank you. And Nicole got the tip initially, and so she gets the credit for finding the story, and she brought me in, and I'm very grateful.
okay. Well, okay. Usually. And Ames, tell us about the Homeowners Association. When I was reading your story, I was struck by, a couple of years ago, actually longer than that, about 5 years ago, the New York Federal Reserve Board, not exactly housing a bunch of wild-eyed liberals or anything like that, did a study where they concluded in the U.S. almost half the people don't have $400 if they face an emergency. Isn't that an amazing statistic? Do you think about it? And I thought of that survey in terms of your story because so many of the people you wrote about owned housing.
Right.
But through failing to pay their homeowners' dues and not seeing the bill, or there were various reasons I realize, they ended up losing their house.
Yeah.
It sounds almost impossible to believe that
Right.
somebody can go through that. But tell us how you got onto that and
Yeah.
what the obstacles were.
Over the years, I've heard a number of complaints from people about their HOAs. There's something about HOAs that really makes people's emotions run hot. And I was reporting early last year on a situation where a woman had a big dispute with her HOA. They began fining her $100 a day for something that was not her fault. A judge later ruled that. But the HOA put a lien on her house, and at that point they could foreclose on her. And after doing that story, I began wondering, how often do HOAs really foreclose on people, and how often do people actually lose their homes as a result of that? So I teamed up with the Raleigh News and Observer's database reporter, David Rayner, and he began looking at courts data to try to tease that out. And I, meanwhile, was looking at the state law, which showed that there is basically, HOAs can foreclose on homeowners for any amount of money. no matter how small. And in fact, they don't even have to appear before a judge to do it. They can get a rubber stamp from a court clerk. And as David did his database analysis, he found that in a 5-year period, HOAs in North Carolina, one state had filed to foreclose on 5,500 homeowners. And they'd actually seized more than 600 homes. And as I started going through the court's data, I started going to the individual paper files in the courthouses. I saw a lot of these people were actually losing their homes for less than $2,000.
Wow.
Yeah.
And these are homes in some cases where they had 100,000 in equity or
Yes.
things of that sort.
And investors would swoop in and
buy
often
it
buy
for-
the houses for like $10,000.
Buy it for a song, yeah.
And so the homeowners were losing not only their homes, but all of their equity.
Wow. What was Joseph Pulitzer's comment? Comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. I mean, that's really what we try to do in our business, and I think every one of these series, every one of these stories really falls into that category. Now, we want to hear from all of you who I hope are champing at the bit to come up and ask us questions. And the questions can be about these series, can be about anything at all, how we do our work, what are the challenges of reporting, how do we face this, that, or the other thing. So don't anybody be shy. Come up and ask us anything that's on your mind. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Nate Johnson. My question is to you, Caitlin. You obviously studied here and you got your master's in investigative journalism. What is one lesson that you learned here that stuck with you through your journalism career?
Oh my God. Okay, so first off, this place is the reason why I was able to pursue this story, to be really honest. Like, I learned so much here that is so valuable. This story in particular, the footnoting, learning how the Howard Center of Investigative Journalism is really very good about process and the way that you go about doing an investigation and the way that you keep yourself organized. And one of the things that they're really good about teaching is the way that you footnote a story like this. So this story had 400 footnote. That feels lower than it was because it was a lot of work. But just a crazy amount of every little tiny fact in this is like how you spell people's names, every number, it's all really carefully footnoted. So that's, I think, one of the big things that process, I used the Howard Center's process. And yeah, that comes from here for sure.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Anna. I'm also pursuing the investigative journalism master's right now.
Yay.
But I'm just wondering, this is for all of you, but what is the most interesting way you've come across an idea, or like what is just the most bizarre thing that's come across your desk that has turned out to be a really good investigation?
Wow.
That's a good question.
There's so many.
Any bizarre one on your part?
I mean, I think for us, when we do projects, oftentimes we're a little unorthodox in that I know a lot of people get tips, and that's kind of, they build their investigation based on somebody's given them a tip or a record or something. We don't typically do that. We're a little, so we kind of have this, we have oftentimes from our own reporting something that we come across, and then we think, okay, let's put this aside and let's come back to it later. And it's an idea that then it's like a, really, it's like this ground up approach. And for us, I think one of the kind of trademarks of a good investigation is when we go to an expert, somebody who studied this and looked at it, and is this, person with an expert next to their name, And we know something about this topic that they've studied for years and years, and they don't know it. And that happens all the time. And when that happens, we know, okay, we have found something that the experts don't know. We're telling them. And I think that, not that the stories coming from TIPS are amazing, and we certainly have gotten those over the years, but I think the big investigations that we've done and the ones that we care the most about, those are the ones that are all just us, and it takes a long time. But then when you get the goods, it's just like, yeah, we know this inside and out, and we're going to tell the experts about it.
I mean, an awful lot of stories I know from ones I've done and colleagues have done, the stories have been right there. Walt McDonich in the New York Times, a good friend of mine who also many years ago won one of these awards, did an amazing series once on railroad crossings, deaths at railroad crossings. The idea came to him when he just saw a couple in his Long Island newspaper, little small items about such and such was killed at a railroad crossing. So and this is almost mirroring something that Ames said. He asked the question, well, how often does that go on, and who's at fault here? I think a lot of people think, a lot of investigative reporting, people start with they got a playbook here. They're going to show this, they're going to show that, they're going to the other thing. Almost everything Don and I did over the years, we started with questions. Is there an oil shortage back when there was a crisis in oil production? Are judges in Philadelphia letting all of these people out on the street to commit crimes? Secondly, did the Tax Reform Act of 1986 really eliminate all tax shelters and make everything fair for everybody? We start with questions, not with answers. And I think that's the way most of us do a lot of our work. And the most amazing thing is almost all these stories are out there already in one way or another. Not the full story, but a little bit of it that gets us started. So it's a very good question on your part.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Jason Teeter. I just have a question. When you finally get the goods to a story, how do you completely tie it up with a bow and a ribbon and make it perfect?
You never do. Impossible.
Yeah, I'm still reading the story and going, that sentence can be slightly different.
I mean, I think even after the story publishes or airs, I'm looking at it going, oh, I wish I had done that a little differently. I don't think it's ever perfect. I mean, I don't know any investigative reporter who would ever say that one was perfect. So always strive for excellence, yeah. But I don't think you can hold yourself to perfection. That's too high of a bar. You don't want to be wrong. You need to be accurate, and you need to dot every I and cross every T, and you need to know every detail about the subject that you're investigating and what you're reporting on. But in terms of the nice, neat bow on top and the delivering it exactly the way that, I just think that it's a moving target, right? And our stories, at least on the TV side, I feel like we a lot of times put out a story and then kind of chip away at it over time. It's never, let's just wait until it's finished, right? Because some stories don't ever end. It's part of my role is to create collaborative investigations across our 8 local stations. And so even when you do a big project and it's getting results and you're doing follow-up after follow-up after follow-up, you're still working on the next project. And so you've got this going over here and this going over here. And, I don't know of any reporters that get to just work on one thing at a time anymore. I don't know that that's reality for most of us. So I don't know. I think that the nice, neat bow it sounds good. I think you get it to the best you can with the amount of time that you have. And then don't be afraid to keep going on it after you've already put it out there.
It's really a great question, and it's one that I think it's occupied us all over the years. And it took me years to realize that I was never, ever felt that anything I ever did was done. There just got to be the point where you finally say, okay, that's it. We've got to put this in the paper. We've got to put this on air. And to the best of your ability, you've tied it up as well as you can. In every story, there were things that, in some cases, we never got to the bottom of. That's just the way it is. And it's one of the things that's both exciting about it, but also, in the end, makes you a touch frustrated that you haven't been able to totally tie that bow up, right?
With our Social Security project, we initially set out with a FOIA in 2022 to find out how many people this was happening to and where they lived, right? So we FOIA'd the number of overpayments by zip code, thinking, well, this should be an easy response, right? Just basic data. They rejected that one, and we're still waiting to hear back on the appeal that was from several years ago. But the way we ultimately got at the numbers was by doing the initial story, getting traction in Congress. They held a congressional hearing, and the Social Security Administration gathered data for that congressional hearing. And we were able to kind of dig deeper from that and find some accountability. And ultimately, we uncovered that it was 2 million people a year who were getting these overpayment notices. I would say we still have questions about those numbers that the agency has not answered. And, we've been reporting on this for more than a year now. And there are many, there was a follow-up at the beginning of this week, and that follow-up alone, based on the results from our story and the policy changes at the agency, we still have questions about those metrics. And I think whenever you're dealing with a company or a federal agency or any, subject of an investigative story, you're never going to get every question answered. I mean, I would say we have more questions than answers in almost all of them. In terms of, I did want to say one other thing about the where you find stories, because I really believe that they can come from anywhere. And, part of my role in working with our 8 stations in 7 states is looking for trends, things that are popping up in multiple cities that haven't really been looked at closely. We did a story on violence against teachers, and the impetus for it was within a week's time, we had viral videos of teachers being attacked in their classroom by kids, in sometimes as young as elementary, middle, high school, whatever. But I was like, gosh, that's strange. In 3 different cities across the country, all at the same time, right, these viral videos. And I started looking for data and found there really wasn't any tracking these incidents, nothing meaningful. And we ended up doing a survey that got 8,000 responses across the country. And teachers wrote in, 1,100, kind of open-ended question where they describe these incidents of being attacked by, an 8-year-old, and desks thrown across the room. And it really painted this picture. And the impetus for the investigation was, well, this is happening in 3 of our 8 cities all at the same time. I wonder if it's a bigger deal.
You asked that question. There you go.
I do want to say one thing too, though. I think you definitely have more questions. Honestly, I feel like I have more questions than answers at the end of an investigation. I think that's true. But I do think there's something to be said for part of your question is about how do you keep a process so that when you sit down to write, you know what you have. Because part of the challenge with an investigation is we've been working on these stories for many, many months. We've got tons and tons of things here. Like, there are so many details. And I'm a big proponent of keeping yourself really organized. I write myself a lot of what I know, what I don't know, what the current nut graph is type stories that I go back to really frequently so that when I sit down to write, I kind of know the story. Or I not know the story because obviously it's all really evolving as you go throughout the reporting process, but I have somewhere to start when I sit down to write because I've kind of been, as I'm reporting, trying to digest the information and keep track of the information. So I think that's, a different element of your question, but that process is really helpful.
Appreciate it. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
So it's unfortunate that Mr. Barlett could not attend tonight. So I want to ask, what qualities of his do you hope to see in the next generation of journalists?
Interesting. Well, one of Don's great qualities was patience. And anytime you're doing a long-range project, investigative or otherwise. There are a lot of days where you feel like you're pushing string uphill. And most of us come out of a journalism background. All my early years in journalism, I was doing daily stories that maybe I worked 4 or 5 days on, but very quick stories, nothing that lasts that long. So a lot of us break into journalism is of a much shorter time frame. So I think one of Don's great things was tremendous patience, and he didn't get frustrated when things weren't happening at the speed we all like them to happen. That was the other thing. The other thing that Don and I both was a quality I think we both had. We both hated hypocrisy in politicians of all parties, and also even of corporate leaders and other private citizens. Anytime there was hypocrisy in something that motivated us. And on top of that, the most important thing was I think we both believed that everybody should be treated equally as best as possible. And that motivated a lot of our reporting on a whole range of stories. Not everything we did had a big human element to it, but equality in some way or another was you can find that in almost everything we did over the years. So that was one of his great qualities.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question.
Hello, I'm Lillian. I'm also on the MAIJ track. My question is for everyone. When you're sourcing and you're trying to find people who are impacted by the problem, can you give us a ballpark of how many people are declining to talk to you before you start to get people who agree?
That's a great. Take it away, guys.
What?
That's a
I
great
more
question.
had the problem of a lot of phone numbers that were not the person I thought I was trying to reach, or were not there were not actually live phone numbers. In building this database of people who had sold their homes to this company, I think I called definitely over 100 people, maybe close to 200 people. And a lot of calls that didn't land. So talk about patience. That's, I think, the bigger challenge. But
I think it varies from story to story. Some are harder than others, I think, depending on the topic. I think, and we talked a little bit about this earlier, in terms of making them feel comfortable and explaining that they're not alone, and kind of what your goals are in presenting the story is helpful. There are always a lot of no's. I think especially on the broadcast side, on TV is a little nerve-wracking for some people to have a big camera in their living room and lights and all of that. It's not people's normal to be able to kind of want to be part of that. So I think there are a lot of no's. I think that's one of the challenges of investigative and kind of what we do. And I think that's only getting harder, day to day, in terms of the polarization and the mistrust and the kinds of things that we're fighting against. I think that it's a challenge, but I think that it's really important to make sure that there are people in every story. At the end of the day, you're telling stories about people, and people at home who are reading it or watching it are going to connect with that story because of the people and the stories you're telling. So I would say in any story you're doing, it's worth the time to wait for it, right? If you're getting a whole bunch of no's, don't rush the story until you have that meaningful person who will help convey why it matters.
And I'm just going to add, because I was a very long-term foreign correspondent, so spent most of my career I've spent overseas working in developing countries. And so I hope some of you sitting out here in the audience want to work overseas, because it will change you in ways that I can't explain. It'll make you more curious, and it'll just change your world. And so I hope that some of you want to do this at some point. And when you're working overseas, sourcing is a very important. That's the core of my reporting is source-based. And, you know, you might be working on something where it's not a no. People will just talk to you. And then you get into a situation where these people, they're in danger. You know they're in danger based on what they've told you. They might not really even understand, you know, like I work for the Associated Press, so my stuff goes out globally, right? They might not even understand that. So then you need to think about what you're doing, who you're talking to. Do they understand? Can whatever they say hurt them? And I think this is the ethics, and this is something that, you know, you have to think about these things. And sometimes you get something really good, and it's really juicy, and you want to use it. But, like, you have to stop yourself and pull back and say, if I put this person's face or this quote or their name, how is this going to impact them? They're living off in the middle of nowhere, you know, in a place where they could be persecuted or attacked, or they could lose their job, or they may be even killed, you know? And so I think that when I think about my stories and the sourcing, you always want to get it. You want to get it, but you need to think about more than just getting it sometimes.
I think both of what you're saying, Margie, and also Jody, you mentioned this, something similar earlier. I think it all comes down to people don't owe you their story. They don't owe me anything. So if they want to help me tell this story, I have such profound appreciation for it. And that genuine appreciation, I think, comes through, and that helps people know that I really care. So that's I really genuinely do. But I think if you come in with things from the, like, you don't owe me your story, but I think we can make a difference if we can tell it together. I think that has been a really powerful mentality to have.
Thank you.
I've got one little vignette on this. That Don Barlett and I did a story for Time magazine on a bankruptcy reform legislation that was pending in Congress roughly around 2000, late 1990s. And the legislation was being pushed by credit card companies and by members of Congress who said, bankruptcy has become very acceptable. It's not bothering people. There's no shame to it anymore. And we need to tighten up the rules of bankruptcy to make sure that people can't do this easily. Well, we asked the question, is that really happening? And so this is a case where time after time we found people who were in bankruptcy. Their names are all publicly available through the courts, through bankruptcy court, because bankruptcy is a part of the federal judicial system. I called person after person after person, getting rejections. I do not want to talk to you. I mean, finally, eventually, I got some people to talk to me. But the point of this story is it actually helped frame the way we were viewing that issue. Rather than people being no longer ashamed of bankruptcy, the fact of the matter is person after person was still very ashamed that they'd gone through bankruptcy. And it really undercut so much of the whole argument that a few people in Congress were making that bankruptcy was no longer something to be ashamed of. So sometimes one of the things that I think we all deal with in journalism are any number of people who don't want to talk to us, right, for various reasons. And eventually you find others who do, and you finally get the story told. But in this case, the ones who didn't want to talk to us actually ended up becoming a part of the story by changing our perception of what bankruptcy meant in the country.
I think if I can just kind of add to that too, I think we've been talking a lot about how it really helps people to know that they're not alone in something. And the most powerful moment to me reporting this story was leaving Lester Schreffler's house in Texas. I'd gone to see him. He's one of the people who sold his house to this company. And we're saying goodbye. And the thing that stuck with him was that he didn't know that other people were in this situation before I called him and said, I've got, I know hundreds of people who have sold their houses to this company, and I can tell you some details about what's happened to some of them. he didn't know that he was not alone. And learning that, I think, is actually what kind of convinced him to participate in the story, because it's a really big ask to say, I want to put you on national radio. Several million people are going to hear this story about this traumatic thing that happened in your life. And people were also really ashamed about, can't believe that this happened to me. But knowing that he was not alone is what convinced him to help me tell the story. And I think it was really healing for him, and it was certainly incredibly rewarding for me because he felt heard. And that was,
So you can see that one of the requirements of being a reporter is that you have to also be persuasive. I mean, obviously, you've got to use legitimate arguments and to tell people that they're not. I think one of the greatest phrases that's emerged from this today is that you are not alone. I mean, I think we've all tried to use that point with people who are reluctant to talk, especially when it's such a widespread problem like that. Anybody else have any more questions?
We have time for one more question. If there's a final question, who wants to round us out? Tie us up. This is probably one of the most important roles you can have here, is to tie this up.
Tie this up. Think about the bow that you and
Exactly.
Jody was talking about.
This gentleman is going to be
the
our
bow
bow.
that doesn't
You have to get
exist.
the bow
Well,
here.
that we're like constantly
All right, excellent.
fixing.
Fictitious bow.
That's right.
All right, so I don't know if this will be the perfect ending question, but I wanted to ask just what does the process of finding these stories look like? And how do you know when a story is going to have this kind of potential to go this far versus when it might kind of reach a lot of dead ends or seem like it's not going far? How do you know when it's worth putting the time and effort into?
I don't think you ever know at the beginning, right? It always, it's a good story, and it matters to a lot of people, but in terms of traction or results, you never know. And it's always, I feel like I'm always surprised when things happen after my reporting. Even 25 years later, I feel like every time there's traction or there's, a legislative change or policy change, I'm like, wow, that actually did something.
I think you get so into the process that I think what governs most of us is the story itself, and you never can predict what's going to happen. I've been involved in stories that had very little immediate effect, but sometimes had apparently a long-term effect, and you can't predict any of that in the beginning. What drives you is that your interest in it, your curiosity about it, trying to answer those questions that are out there that are on your mind. I think that's what probably drives most of us. And every one of these, just in kind of winding this up here for all of us, I guess you should wind it up, but the great thing about every one of these series that is honored today, these stories, running through all of them is this great human factor. And that's the thing, again, I said this at the beginning, any of you budding journalists out there, try to imagine how people can figure into that story. And finding people is one of the most demanding things that we do in our business. Sometimes they don't want to talk to us. Sometimes they want to talk too much. But mainly, finding them is crucial to propelling that story forward in most cases. So, and it's a very demanding thing. It takes a lot of extra effort, but that comes with the territory. It's never easy, but it's worth the hunt. It's worth the sweat that you put into it.
It's also, those are the people who are at the center of the story are the ones who stick with me. I have so much knowledge about random things because of the work that we do. But the thing that comes back to me over and over and over are the people who I met for the stories that I do. So hopefully that's what makes an impact to the readers too. Hopefully that's what helps people get the why, as you were saying. But it's also really what those are the people that are in the back of my brain. And I can tell you their kids' names. I can tell you what sports their kids do. I can tell you so much information because they had an impact on me as a reporter too.
And as far as your question about where to find the story, I think that for any budding journalist out there, and most of us start out in general assignment and kind of day-to-day coverage, what I always tell our young reporters is at the end of every shift, write down the questions you still have. It's usually why, how, whose fault is it? right? Like those are the investigative questions. And sometimes all you can do is get the who, when, where, what, and, you know, get it on deadline and have it be, you know, correct and quality. But you don't always get to answer those questions right away. But I would keep a running list every single day of the questions you still have, because then the next time you do get a few minutes, you can file a FOIA request, or you can make a few phone calls and try to answer those lingering questions, and then you've got another story and another story and another story.
That is why my desk is covered in sticky notes, is those questions.
And one clue, you never know. Like, I still ask myself, did anybody ever read the story that I wrote like 10 years ago? But one clue is, if you think that you found something that's interesting, and you are surrounded by really smart people, which I'm sure you all are, go to those people and tell them what you've heard and see how they react. Because I can tell you, with this project that we're working on, we were kind of like, wait a minute, we don't know about this, but maybe it's because we've been overseas or we just somehow missed this. And then we started mentioning this to people that we know who are very well-read, very well-rounded people, editors, people who have been in the business a long time. And they were like, what are you talking about, huh? And then we were like, okay, it's not just us. I think we're onto something here. So, you know, you can just don't go to the competition. Don't go to anybody working for the New York Times and tell them what you're doing.
But that's actually, I love that, because that's what I've been, the story that I'm currently on, I didn't quite know if it was a story when I started. I was gonna do it in a different way. And then it's talking to people at the coffee machine at NPR HQ in DC, and talking to the Middle Eastern editor who is a pal, and he asks what I'm working on, and I say, oh, I'm doing this story. It's a juvenile justice story. Here's the detail. And he goes, I had no idea. And that's exactly that's why I was like, okay, maybe I should do the story this way, because, yeah.
Good advice.
And it's what Jim is fond of saying, tell us something we don't know. And one of the things I always say is, business journalism, many people think it's about money, it's about rich people, but it's about people that are affected by all this. Oftentimes the most vulnerable populations, and that's why we do this. I want to thank Jim and our fantastic award winners this year. I want to thank the Reynolds team and the CRONKITE team for doing such a wonderful job on this event tonight, and I want to thank you in the audience for coming to help us celebrate tonight and for your wonderful questions. Thank you so much. Thank you.